Today, I want to tell you the true origin of African Americans. The true origin of African Americans. So, many have been asking what is the true origin of African Americans? The true origin is the one everyone knows. People need to understand and accept the fact that many times what historical tradition told was actually the truth, especially when it was corroborated by documents and contemporary accounts. Many times people wish that the true origins of the true history were more fantastic, perhaps more heroic and surprising, but no. This is one of those cases where conspiracy theories and bias revisionism only confuse people instead of enlightening them and making them understand their past better in order to improve their future. So, African Americans arrived in the 17th century together with the European immigrants that were also flocking to the eastern coast of North America, what is now the United States of America, USA. The first of them were even indentured servants, not outright slaves perpetually owned by their masters. Some African blacks had already visited the territory of the United States in Spaniard missions to explore the newly found lands, but they mostly did not settle there. In the mid-17th century and especially during the 18th century, the traffic of slaves intensified gradually. The Africans who were enslaved and shipped to the Americas came from different parts of Africa, but most of those who went to the United States came from West Africa. In the case of African Americans, mostly from places in or near Senegal, Gambia and Guinea, and from Central Africa, especially Angola. There was also a minority who came from Eastern Africa, either from the lands that are now Mozambique or a small minority from Sudan. In America, the slaves mixed willingly or more often unwillingly with the Europeans, and there was also some tiny admixture along the generations with the people who are Native Americans or descended partially from them. Sometimes African American slaves would flee and be accepted into Amerindian tribes. That is how the African American community came to exist. A large majority, around 80% of African ancestry, a small amount of European ancestry, which is 20%, and a tiny proportion of Native American ancestry in a part of that community. There are some fringe groups who want to publicize an alternative version of history in which African Americans are the true natives of the Americas, or at least of the present day USA, and Native Americans were later arrivals and competitors before Columbus arrived in the shores of Hispaniola. That theory has no strong evidence at all in archaeology, historical documents, genetics, and anthropology. Many of the traditions that blacks perceived in a way clearly distinctive from those maintained by whites and Amerindians clearly are back to traditions and customs that are strongly present even in modern African cultures. That similarity of traditions, beliefs, and cultural practices will be an extremely improbable outcome if the blacks from the Americans had been totally separate from the Africans for dozens of thousands of years until a few centuries ago. Besides, the genetic makeup of African Americans and of other black people elsewhere in the Americas is visibly close to that of African blacks and derives directly from them, especially the West and Central Africans. They are only further apart from them due to the widespread mixing with Europeans and less so Native Americans, but the African Americans with least non-African ancestry are very, very close to African proxies who are native to African nations. That again would be extremely improbable if the blacks from the Americas had developed on their own independently from the blacks from Africa for the past dozens of thousands of years. More than enough time for genetic drift and the differentiating effects of genetic processes like bottlenecks, founder effects, and selective evolutionary pressures to act and therefore make those two populations clearly distinct from each other genetically. So, the populations that are closest to the main ancestors of the African Americans are the many ethnicities that live roughly from Senegal to Angola in the western portion of Africa, and the populations whose origins are closest to those of the African Americans are other black populations living in the Americas who also descend from the same wave of forced immigrations, only with the differences in the degree of mixing with non-Africans and in the specific distribution of the slaves according to their national origins in Africa.